Did you know Bonnie and Clyde changed the way we look at movies forever? In the history of cinema, certain films challenge the established norms and usher in a new wave of creativity. And Arthur Penn's 1967 classic is definitely one of them. It was not only the final nail in the coffin destroying the system of censorship that had dominated the film industry for years, but it also ushered in one of the most creative periods in the history of American film. But we'll get right back to Bonnie and Clyde. To fully understand the impact of this film, we must first understand the Haze Code. Now, pre-MPAA, Hollywood had what was called the Haze Code to censor films. The studio system was a rigid and dominant force in Hollywood from the 1920s to the 1950s. It was a vertically integrated business model that consolidated control over film production, distribution, and exhibition, which kind of sounds like streamers today. This system allowed studios like Paramount, MGM, and Warner Brothers to have a stranglehold on the industry and dictate the type of films that were produced and released. Now, within this system, they chose to maximize profits by adhering to what was called the Haze Code. The Haze Code, which was enforced from the 1930s to the mid-1960s, limited the portrayal of certain themes that were deemed inappropriate or offensive. It imposed censorship prohibiting explicit violence, sexuality, and morally ambiguous characters. Films were expected to uphold traditional values and present a sanitized version of reality. Now, this code was a response to many pre-1930s scandals in Hollywood, but I won't get into that in this video. Let me know if you want to see that video. But just know, early Hollywood was wild. Today ain't got shit on that. During the same period, concerns about the influence and moral impact of movies led to the establishment of the self-regulatory system known as the Motion Picture Production Code, commonly referred to as the Haze Code, named after its chief advocate, Will H. Haze, who served as a president of the Motion Picture Producer and Distributors of America, or the MPPDA. The Haze Code was officially adopted in 1930, although it took some years for the enforcement to really go through. The Haze Code sought to clean up the image of American cinema, responding to the criticisms of certain religious groups and conservatives. It provided a list of guidelines known as the Production Code Administration that films had to adhere to in order to receive a production code seal, indicating they met the requirements for release. Now, the Haze Code reached its height of influence during the 1930s and the 1940s. Some of the major guidelines and restrictions included no profanity or offensive language, no explicit portrayals of violence or brutality, no nudity or indecent exposure, no explicit or graphic sexual content, no sympathetic portrayals of criminal or immoral behavior, no portrayals of interracial relationships, no criticisms of the government or institutions, no excessive portrayals of drug use, and no religious blasphemy or sacrilegious content. Now, the PCA reviewed scripts and final cuts of films to make sure that filmmakers complied to these restrictions. Now, all of this resulted in a morally sanitized version of films coming out of America. I know, what does all this have to do with Bonnie and Clyde? We're getting there. Give me a second. In the 1950s, social and cultural attitudes shifted, and filmmakers started to challenge the Haze Code's authority. But even before that, filmmakers were finding ways around the code. They would do little subtle things that sometimes the PCA didn't pick up on, or they would negotiate compromises between the two of them. They would use things like double entendres to suggest things without explicitly saying them, which the audience could always pick up on, but it didn't technically break any rules. This allowed them to address things directly, relying on the audience's imagination and comprehension of what they were trying to say. Films like Some Like It Hot in 1959 used witty dialogue in situations that contained veiled references to sexuality, challenging the Haze Code's restrictions. Symbolism and metaphor also became a powerful tool that filmmakers would use to suggest things to audiences that would otherwise be prohibited. For instance, the famous shower scene from Psycho in 1960 cleverly conveyed violence and horror through the use of montage and carefully selected shot selection, avoiding explicit depictions that would have violated the Haze Code. Filmmakers also used allegory to get across what they wanted to say. Using allegorical narratives would often be the way that filmmakers chose to portray social and political content. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, tackled the Cold War and nuclear arms race through dark humor and satire, allowing the film to comment on the political climate while ostensibly adhering to the Haze Code. Filmmakers would also set their stories in historical context, which allowed them to challenge the social norms without them being the modern social norms, so the Haze Code was kind of okay with that. Films like Gone with the Wind and A Streetcar Named Desire tackled issues of sexuality, violence, and racial tension within the context of the past, which provided enough distance from contemporary audiences for the Haze Code to let it pass. Filmmakers would would also use loopholes to get around the Haze Code. For instance, they could show a character that was morally ambiguous or committed crimes as long as they came to justice by the end of the film. So they could have protagonists that technically followed the Haze Code but also were a bit more anti-hero. Now, a series of court cases in the 1950s, like the United States versus Paramount Pictures, broke apart the monopoly in the vertically integrated studio system, allowing for more independently creative filmmakers to pop up.
Known as the Paramount case, the first blow was in 1938, when the Justice Department sued the 5 major studios and ordered them to stop block booking and blind bidding.
Basic idea of the Paramount case was that the big studios were engaged in monopolistic practices.
So by the mid-1960s, the Haze Code's authority was significantly diminished. Now, in 1966, seeing the writing on the wall, the production code was dismantled and replaced by the MPAA in their rating system, which all of us are familiar with today. This allowed for a wider range of content and allowed audiences to make an informed choice on what they were watching. Early MPAA rating system was a little different from what we had now. We had G for general audiences, M for mature audiences, R for restricted audiences, and X for adults only. But that essentially marked the end of the Haze Code, which directly led to New Hollywood, which was a creative explosion in the United States. And Bonnie and Clyde was a catalyst of this change. I told you we'd get back to Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde was groundbreaking in the way it portrayed its narrative. It followed the story of the real-life couple Bonnie and Clyde, who were notorious criminals, but instead of portraying them as bad people, they portrayed them as charismatic and funny and fun to be around, which was a serious departure from the established norms. And seeing this on screen was both thrilling and unsettling for audiences of the time. The film was written by David Newman and Robert Benton, and it captured the essence of rebellion and social unrest that was really prevalent in the 1960s. By sympathetically exploring the motivations and emotions of its protagonists and challenging the simple black and white portrayals of characters in previous films, it essentially created a new Hollywood. Bonnie and Clyde also pushed American cinema forward by adopting some of the techniques that were happening in the French New Wave. Techniques like freeze frames and nonlinear story structure and jump cuts were added to this film, which made it feel even fresher for American audiences. Now, this movie had gritty and realistic violence, which was completely different from anything that audiences in America had seen before. And it was controversial at the time, but it was super impactful on everybody that saw it. Now, this film would be nothing without critical and commercial success, which it had both of. And because of that, it not only inspired a new generation of filmmakers, but also allowed studios to be a little bit more bold with their filmmaking. This film, along with other early New Hollywood films such as Easy Rider in 1969 and Midnight Cowboy in 1969 and The Graduate in 1967, further exemplified this transformative period for American cinema. Many filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino marked this as the start of New Hollywood, which led to films like The Godfather and Taxi Driver and Jaws and eventually Star Wars and beyond. This film not only challenged the system, but challenged societal norms. It brought forward the youth rebellious movement that was happening at the time that completely shifted Hollywood of the 1960s from one way to another. And without it, would we have the bold works of Scorsese and De Palma and Peter Bogdanovich and so many filmmakers that came out in the 70s? I don't really know. Possibly, but I don't know. But this film really changed everything that we know about Hollywood.